Africa is no longer waiting for permission. From nuclear energy breakthroughs to industrial dominance, from bold leadership to the unstoppable spirit of its youth, the continent is rising. Witness the journey of a united Africa, reclaiming its dignity, power, and place in the world. This is the story of Africa standing tall, confident, and unstoppable. Africa will no longer bow to any nation as a new consciousness is rising within the continent, a consciousness built on dignity, confidence, and unshakable sovereignty. And this awakening is becoming clearer than ever through South Africa's bold decision that shook the world when it refused to follow the traditional protocol of flying to the United States for the ceremonial handover of the G20 presidency, a step that countless nations have followed without question for decades. But this time, South Africa decided to break the pattern and announced firmly that if the United States wants the baton of leadership, then it must treat Africa with respect, because Africa will not cross oceans merely to uphold rituals designed for the convenience of others. A decision that was not rude or confrontational, but an assertion of equality and self-respect, reminding the world that Africa is no longer a continent to be instructed, pressured, or ordered. For generations, African leaders have been expected to travel to Western capitals seeking approval, validation, or assistance, creating an imbalance of power that placed Africa in a submissive position. But the modern era is different, and South Africa's refusal to travel showed that African nations now see themselves as equal partners in global politics, not passive participants. And this firm stance ignited celebration across the continent as millions of Africans praised this courageous act, viewing it as a symbol of continental pride and a sign that Africa's political psychology is evolving from dependency to dignity. And this is why social media platforms were flooded with messages calling the decision historic, because it demonstrated that Africa can stand tall even when facing global giants like the United States, reinforcing the idea that Africa is rising into a new stage of unity, self-awareness, and political maturity. And South Africa's boldness symbolizes that the era of bowing is over and the era of standing strong has begun, marking a transformation that will be remembered as a turning point in African diplomacy and continental leadership. And as Africa stands at the edge of a technological rebirth, it begins to understand that true progress is not measured by the abundance of natural resources, but by the power to transform them. And this transformation can only happen when a continent has stable, uninterrupted electricity flowing through its industries, laboratories, hospitals, and cities. And in this new era, nuclear energy emerges not as an optional luxury, but as the backbone of long-term development, the energy source that does not flicker with weather patterns, rising fuel prices, or unstable imports. And as African nations step deeper into this nuclear age, they unlock the door to economic independence, technological leadership, and industrial expansion on a scale the world has rarely witnessed. Because once power becomes reliable, everything else begins to rise with it, creating a chain reaction that reshapes every corner of society. Factories that once struggled with unpredictable outages now operate around the clock, producing goods that were previously imported at high cost. Investors who previously hesitated due to unstable grids now pour money into long-term projects. Tech companies begin to view African cities as hubs for innovation rather than developing markets. And local businesses, small shops, farms, workshops suddenly gain the confidence to expand because electricity is no longer a gamble, but a guarantee. And this single guarantee creates millions of jobs and keeps wealth circulating inside the continent instead of leaking away through endless fuel imports. Nuclear energy becomes the invisible engine behind growth, allowing African nations to shift from exporting raw minerals such as copper, lithium, and cobalt to manufacturing high-value products like batteries, electric vehicles, advanced electronics, medical equipment, and robotics components within their own borders, which not only multiplies national income, but strengthens currencies and transforms Africa from a supply of raw materials to a producer of finished goods. And as nuclear reactors stabilize the grid, foreign dependency begins to shrink, replacing years of vulnerability with strategic strength, because countries no longer have to spend billions importing diesel or gas just to keep their lights on. Now they control their energy future with their own reactors, engineers, and systems. And this energy sovereignty becomes a shield for national security, a foundation for industrial growth, and a magnet for global investors seeking stable, clean, low-cost power.
And beyond economics, the environmental impact is profound, as nuclear power reduces carbon emissions without slowing progress, complementing solar, wind, and hydro to form a modern, efficient energy mix that is both clean and incredibly powerful, giving Africa the unique opportunity to leapfrog old polluting systems and build a future that is technologically advanced and environmentally responsible at the same time. And with this leap forward, Africa begins to reshape global perception, proving that it is not a passive participant in global technology, but an emerging leader capable of mastering complex, high-tech systems once considered out of reach, such as advanced reactors, medical isotopes, space research, and robotics, all powered by the stable energy foundation nuclear provides. And as nations embrace this transformation, a psychological shift begins to unfold across the continent, where young engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs start believing that Africa is not merely catching up, but preparing to lead. And this belief becomes the spark behind a new generation of innovation, a generation that sees no limit to what the continent can achieve. Because once a people gain confidence in their abilities and infrastructure, they stop accepting the world's outdated assumptions about them and begin writing their own story, boldly, ambitiously, and unapologetically. And that is the true power of Africa's nuclear awakening, not just the electricity it generates, but the mindset it ignites, the confidence it cultivates, and the future it makes possible, where Africa no longer waits for permission, no longer depends on outside saviors, and no longer doubts its place in the world, but steps forward as a continent ready to forge its destiny with its own hands, its own knowledge, and its own unstoppable energy. As Africa moves deeper into this new age of energy stability and industrial expansion, a more profound transformation begins to unfold, one that reaches beyond technology, beyond economics, and beyond the physical infrastructure rising across the continent. Because the true revolution is happening inside the minds of millions who are witnessing, perhaps for the first time in generations, what it looks like when a nation controls its own future. From classrooms where young students study nuclear physics and robotics with the confidence that these careers now exist at home, to universities building laboratories that once felt impossible, to local industries finally daring to imagine manufacturing their own machines, turbines, electronics, and medical systems instead of importing them. The spirit of possibility starts spreading like a rising tide, reshaping not just economies, but identities. And this shift becomes the foundation of Africa's most powerful transformation, the reclaiming of dignity, capacity, and national direction. And as power grids stabilize and industries expand, governments begin strengthening laws, regulations, and local content policies that ensure resources are not merely extracted, but refined, processed, and manufactured within African borders, keeping wealth circulating internally, building strong currencies, and turning once dependent nations into competitive economic engines. Countries that were previously vulnerable due to unpredictable energy supplies now negotiate from a position of strength because they offer something global industries desperately need: reliable electricity, abundant resources, and a young, skilled workforce ready to transform the future. With these advantages combined, Africa evolves from a continent defined by its challenges into a continent defined by its potential, drawing the attention of global investors, scientists, innovators, and technology companies who now see Africa not as an aid-dependent region, but as the next powerhouse of industrial growth. And as this energy revolution continues, African governments take bold steps to integrate nuclear energy with other emerging technologies, creating combined systems where clean power fuels desalination plants, advanced agricultural systems, AI-driven manufacturing lines, digital innovation hubs, and continent-wide data networks that connect millions into a new digital economy, proving that stable energy is the foundation of national progress in every field, from healthcare, where hospitals finally operate without power shortages, to transportation systems that become electrified, modernized, and efficient, to research institutions researching vaccines, medical isotopes, and biotechnology without fear of outages disrupting their operations. And with each of these advancements, Africa rises another step closer to global competitiveness, gradually breaking free from the centuries-long cycle of dependency and exploitation that held the continent back, reclaiming ownership of its resources, its industries, and its future. And this rise is not quiet. It echoes across borders, inspiring neighboring countries to adopt the same model of stability, modernization, and resource sovereignty, triggering a continental wave of reforms, investments, and bold decisions that mark a beginning of Africa's long-awaited transformation. And in this moment, Africa stands not as a fragmented set of nations, but as a collective force, stepping into a future shaped by its own ideas, its own innovations, and its own leaders who no longer measure Africa by old stereotypes, but by the strength, intelligence, and determination of its people. Because at the heart of this new era lies a simple truth. When a nation controls its energy, it controls its industries. When it controls its industries, it controls its economy. And when it controls its economy, it controls its destiny. And today, as nuclear power, industrial expansion, and resource sovereignty converge, Africa crosses a historic threshold where the old limitations fall away and a new identity takes their place. An identity built on strength, stability, creativity, and the belief that the continent is no longer behind the world, but rising to stand beside it, equal, capable, and ready to lead. And as this journey continues, the message becomes clear. Africa's future will not be written by outsiders, not dictated by foreign powers, and not shaped by dependency or scarcity, but built by Africans themselves, engineers, leaders, students, thinkers, workers, and dreamers who now see that the impossible was never truly impossible, only waiting for the moment when Africa finally had the power, literally and figuratively, to rise, transform, and own its place in the world. As Africa steps deeper into this new chapter of dignity and industrial awakening, a more powerful shift begins unfolding across the political landscape. Because beyond energy, beyond resources, beyond global partnerships, the greatest transformation is happening inside the halls of leadership, where African nations, once pressured, manipulated, and dictated to by superpowers, are now rewriting the rules of engagement, no longer entering negotiations from a position of need, but from a position of strength and equality. And this is seen in the growing number of leaders refusing unfair terms, rejecting exploitative agreements, and demanding transparency and accountability from foreign investors who for decades operated without challenge. And as Africa gains confidence, the world begins to adjust, because the continent is no longer the silent participant. It has become a decisive voice in global politics, raising issues of fair trade, currency stability, resource sovereignty, and technological cooperation with a firmness that surprises nations long accustomed to controlling the continent.
And while powerful countries still attempt to influence Africa through economic pressure, political narratives, or military presence, they now face a continent far more informed, united, and strategic than ever before. Especially as African youth, educated, connected, globally aware, refuse to accept the old patterns of dependency and inequality. And their determination becomes the heartbeat of Africa's new identity, pushing governments to invest more in education, science, infrastructure, and digital innovation, so that Africa's future is shaped not by outside expectations, but by the capability of its own people. And across the continent, a new leadership philosophy emerges, one built on sovereignty, accountability, and national interest, where leaders proudly declare that Africa will no longer be a battleground for foreign competition, but a center for fair partnerships. And this thinking changes everything, encouraging African states to strengthen regional alliances, expand cross-border trade, build new transport corridors, and adopt shared economic strategies that benefit entire regions instead of individual nations. Because they now understand that a united Africa is the only Africa that cannot be dominated. And while challenges still exist, corruption, inequality, internal conflicts, the difference is that Africa now confronts these issues with the confidence of a continent that knows its worth and refuses to be defined by its struggles. And with this rising unity, foreign powers begin seeing Africa not as a place to extract wealth, but as a partner whose cooperation is essential for their own economic survival. Because Africa holds the minerals for the future: lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, uranium, rare earth elements, resources that will determine the next era of global technology, from electric vehicles to satellites to artificial intelligence. And as African nations realize the value of what lies beneath their soil, they declare that raw minerals will no longer be exported cheaply while finished goods are imported at high prices. Because Africa will now refine, process, and manufacture its own wealth, ensuring that the benefits stay on the continent. And this awakening ripples into diplomacy, where African states speak with a new tone:
Firm, strategic, principled, reminding the world that Africa is not desperate, not powerless, and not waiting for permission to rise. And as this mindset spreads, a new international reality begins forming. Treaties that once favored foreign nations are renegotiated, long ignored debts are questioned, unfair political pressures are rejected, and Africa no longer accepts being treated as a junior member of the international community. And this boldness does not isolate the continent. Rather, it elevates it, earning a respect from nations that once overlooked Africa's potential, because strength attracts respect, and dignity attracts partnership. And through this confidence, Africa steps into a future where it commands global attention not through conflict, not through dependency, but through competence, unity, and purpose. And as this rise continues, one truth becomes clearer than ever. Africa is not just participating in global history anymore. Africa is shaping it, influencing it, and preparing to lead it in ways the world never expected. And this shift, rooted in sovereignty, powered by unity, and driven by a new generation, marked the beginning of the Africa the world will soon have no choice but to recognize: confident, capable, strategic, and unstoppable. It as a decisive player on the global stage, because a united Africa is a powerful Africa, capable of setting rules rather than following them, shaping markets rather than being subjected to them, and defining its own path rather than relying on external direction. And as African countries gain leverage through strategic energy independence, industrial growth, and technological mastery, the world begins to notice. And slowly, respect replaces condescension, curiosity replaces disregard, and partnership replaces exploitation, as other nations recognize that Africa is no longer a passive partner, but an equal force whose interests, insights, and contributions cannot be ignored.
And this evolution of perception mirrors an internal transformation as well, because citizens across the continent now see themselves differently, believing in their ability to build, govern, and innovate, creating a virtuous cycle where confidence fuels action, action produces results, and results reinforce pride, ambition, and leadership, all of which are essential to sustaining the continent's rise. And while challenges remain, such as political instability, corruption, unequal access to resources, and climate pressures, Africa approaches these obstacles with a new mindset, one of problem solving, innovation, and collective responsibility, knowing that solutions are within reach if nations collaborate, invest wisely, and leverage the power of their people. And this is reflected in increasing investments in education, scientific research, digital infrastructure, and healthcare systems, all aimed at equipping the next generation with the tools to lead Africa into a truly self-reliant and globally competitive era, where imagination, skill, and determination matter more than foreign validation or external approval. And as these trends continue, Africa is poised to enter a phase of unprecedented growth, stability, and influence, one in which the continent's narrative is finally authored by its own people, and its future is no longer defined by external expectations, by internal capability, vision, and courage. And the message is clear to the world: Africa is awake, Africa is rising, and Africa will no longer wait for permission. It will define its own destiny, not in the shadows of others, but in the full light of its own power, unity, and determination. A continent capable of shaping global politics, economics, science, and culture, with leaders, innovators, and youth ready to lead boldly, transform relentlessly, and claim the respect, dignity, and equality that has always been deserved. And this is the Africa that emerges today, confident, skilled, proud, innovative, united, and unstoppable, standing tall as a beacon of possibility, resilience, and transformative power, showing the world that the age of Africa's subservience is over and the era of Africa's self-determination, leadership, and global influence has truly begun.